This is a complex and compelling story about Africa, a continent of vast open spaces, huge offshore waters and a century-old oil industry. A story chronicled by Duncan Clarke with over 30 years in the oil game. From his pen sprang Africa, Crude Continent, the struggle for Africa's oil prize, the story of the continent's oil business. And what a business it is. In the words of one veteran journalist, it is a subject that has baffled, frustrated and confused a galaxy of pop stars and supermodels, academics and UN experts.
Well, Africa is a part of the global game, and in production it generates around 13% of crude. On the other hand, its reserves are around 9 to 10%, but these are growing.
The African oil industry has transformed Africa and is shaping its future.
It's growing in strategic significance and importance. It's also a big frontier for the future. Many of the countries haven't fully opened up. They're immature. There are many basins available still for full-scale exploration. So for the long term, as a big part of the developing world in the landscape on the one side and on the oceanic side, offshore deep water and the exclusive economic zones, it has a huge importance for resource base and for potential in reserve discovery and production.
The 1884-85 Berlin Conference carved up Africa in a rush for empire, setting off the scramble for Africa. Europe's great powers drew the boundaries of modern states. Colonization followed, lasting around 70 years, ushering in new economic modes. New rulers, Africans, took power with elites forming one-party states, military juntas or ethnic majorities. Cold War superpowers divided their allegiances. The second scramble for Africa was born, a turbulent era with over 70 coups d'etat in the first 30 years of independence.
The third scramble for Africa in the sense of a resource lunge coming from the private industry as well as local companies, including more African interests and foreign state companies from abroad. And that's about the oil and the gas, the LNG, the coal bed methane, all the energy resources that could be of use not only to Africa but to the export markets.
Oil discoveries in the Sahara and West Africa in the 1960s reshaped many independent states. It set up Africa's inner dilemma: how to handle islands of modernity amidst a sea of poverty. Can oil modernize Africa?
It depends on how conducive the countries on the African continent will be for foreign investors to participate. It is give and take. If the investment climate is good, people will come, because private companies, of course, they have a profitability constraint. They are quite often funded by shareholders and they want to see return. So I think the potential is there. Whether in all the countries to equal attraction of foreign investment will depend on the terms.
Quasi-Malthusian reality haunts many an economy. Older African social patterns rule much that lies beyond the writ of governments. A mix of ancient and feudal sits beside the emergent first world islands of modernity. Yet Africa is rich in resources. Oil is but one, but Africa has earned an unenviable reputation in mismanaging its wealth.
I think the danger could be that the politicians get out ahead of themselves and try and milk the potential before it's actually found.
Transition to modernity must negotiate these schisms within Africa. There will be no quick fix. Writers, politicians and analysts have tried to diagnose Africa's problems. Many have failed. They've suggested everything: foreign aid, imported ideas, homegrown theories, state-driven models and macroeconomic measures. Against the tide, the oil industry has expanded over the decades, finding new frontiers. Oil and natural resources in Africa have now drawn in the great powers. Today, investors come from China, India, Asia, Brazil, Russia and the Middle East. There's a state and corporate rush for Africa's open lands and offshore blocks, leased to the oil industry.
The prize is a glimmer in the eye of many. There are over 500-600 companies on the continent. There are many state companies coming into Africa now, more than 33 at this point, compared to a handful, literally, at the turn of the century. And the prize is the reserves, the production, the oil and gas as well, the LNG ventures that are destined to export markets. And of course, there's a big investment prize. But there's a big chunk of that prize that goes to African governments because of the state take In other words, the total revenues that accrue to the governments and to their state companies. So it's a prize that many can share if this is also looked at from a point of view of economic interest and the impacts that the industry makes for revenue.
The scramble for oil continues despite recent economic crisis. All want a piece of Africa's oil bounty, a prize rooted in humble beginnings. By the 1960s, companies explored 17 countries along the Gulf of Guinea. In Nigeria, Shell drilled the first well at Olobiri, opening the Niger Delta. North Africa's onshore proved productive. By 1975, ventures littered West Africa. Frontier drilling followed in southern and eastern Africa. By 1985, Africa had opened its offshore. Then came tough times. Civil unrest, border disputes, political upheaval and contract uncertainties bedeviled progress. Crude oil prices collapsed in 1986 and company budgets were cut. By the 1990s, a new era had dawned. Higher prices, arrival of independent companies, new acreage and gas commercialization sparked industry revival. Countries sought exploration dollars. More companies emerged from overseas markets like AIM, others as private vehicles. Foreign state oil companies from all continents arrived after 2000, led by Asia. The oil search against resource nationalism pressures in countries like Venezuela and Russia made Africa the great frontier.
You see many frontier countries now that are at the earliest stage where the oil industry is likely to have a big impact on their future. Two prominent cases right now are the discovery and development of oil going on in Uganda and secondarily in Ghana.
A few dominate oil production: Nigeria, Angola, Libya, Algeria, Sudan, Egypt and Equatorial Guinea. Secondary producers include Congo, Gabon, Cameroon, DRC, Tunisia, Côte d'Ivoire and South Africa, which faces imminent oil reserve decline and relies on synfuels and gas to liquids. African crude output is rising. With 12 million barrels a day now, output may be 14 million barrels a day by 2015. It's the same story for gas, more found each year, along with rising exports by LNG and pipeline. Oil reserves have also grown sharply. Global Pacific and Partners, an advisory firm in Africa, estimates sub-Saharan proven oil reserves at around 70 billion barrels, with future oil potential at some 80 to 100 billion barrels. North Africa has another 50-plus billion barrels proven, with perhaps 100 billion yet to be found. Continent-wide, 500 trillion cubic feet of gas is proven. Already 20 African countries have gas reserves.
I think Africa is still, from the oil and gas sector, an extremely interesting continent. Large areas are virtually unexplored, but it isn't just a simple game as like people will drill wells and it'll come. Yeah, you need to put your mind to it.
Discoveries were also made in many frontier zones: Madagascar, Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique and Sierra Leone. But exploration effort has been long, sometimes arduous, with risk.
Yeah, that's it. We're definitely wildcatters. We're explorationists. We're looking for the big return, and we embrace risk.
Discovery is never assured. Success requires joint ventures and typically partnerships with state oil companies. In Ghana, the Tullow Oil Anadarko Cosmos venture found world-class oil fields in the Jubilee and other finds. Nearby, Vanco Energy with Lukoil discovered gas condensate reserves. In Uganda, minnows broke open the landlocked basin, once thought inaccessible, along Lake Albert.
A few years ago, nobody would have dreamt that anything like that could have happened. Uganda was regarded as not likely to have any oil discoveries. Now in the Albertine Rift, there's been a huge string of successes.
Now Tullow, with Total and Sinuk, will develop these large fields with a refinery and crude export pipeline to the coast. Madagascar has large heavy oil reserves proven to be developed by Total and partners. The large Windjammer gas discovery by Anadarko in northern Mozambique has reignited interest in East Africa's vast coastal margins. There, Sasol Petroleum International is a major producer of export gas to South Africa, supplying Mozambique from its onshore Pande Temane gas fields, near which offshore discoveries have been made. The great African frontier is nowhere near full exploration.
Africa's had a century of exploration, Obviously, it's built up over time. This is not a short-term game. And I think you can see another 50 to 100 years of oil and gas development across the continent.
Morocco has huge offshore zones lightly explored and large onshore areas. Algeria and Libya only recently opened up offshore blocks. Senegal, Mauritania, Mali and Central African Republic have seen little drilling. In Ethiopia, companies explore the Ogaden and elsewhere, a recent effort. Eritrea holds hopes in the Red Sea.
If you look at that whole Horn of Africa, it's surrounded by multi-billion barrel fields on all sides. I mean, just to the north in Yemen, there's 6 billion barrels. Just to the west in Sudan, there's 6 billion barrels. We've got the new discovery in Albert Graben in Uganda, which has over 1 billion barrels. And Madagascar, which was actually sitting just offshore during the Jurassic, has about 20 billion barrels of oil. So we know the systems are there. What we like about East Africa is it's just been completely ignored for the last 20 years.
Vast onshore basins in the DRC are considered prospective, yet have seen little exploration effort. The Cuvette Centrale is a super basin of 750,000 square kilometers in the heart of Africa.
The potential is very, very big, I think, because the future of oil in the world is in Congo. Why? Because we have 3 main basins: the coastal basin, the central basin, and the west branch of the East African rift.
Rift Valley states, Burundi, Rwanda, DRC's Great Lakes are at the earliest phase of their exploration cycles. Tanzania and Kenya have large frontiers, most yet to see the drill bit. Zambia only placed its 29 blocks on the market in 2009. Several island states, Sao Tome and Principe, the Comores, await fuller exploration. All this augurs well for the exploration future. More countries are involved than ever before. Acreage pickup has been rapid. More oil companies are in Africa. Investment is rising. There are more oil producers, 19 at the last count, and more exporters. A similar story exists for gas, with more exploration, discoveries, and rising production.
Well, investment in African oil and gas has been on an upward trend for a good 15 years, and it accelerated in the first decade of the 21st century. We've seen no major reduction in that during the global recession. Companies have had to slow down. Some projects have been put on hold, and a few have been rescheduled. But in general, the numbers of companies coming in is strongly upward on trend. Investment is still there. Opportunities are being taken to market, and we see this going forward for the next decade or two as being a real significant upside that should have a big effect on total foreign direct investment into Africa.
Oil revenues accruing to governments are large and growing, a foundation for many African economies. Billions will be invested in Africa's oil game in the next decade, with $50 billion in Angola in the next 5 years. Yet Africa needs more capital to unlock its massive oil prize, today equal to 250 billion barrels of oil equivalent. At $80 a barrel, this is worth $15 trillion in gross value. The treasure is spread unevenly over Africa's 30,000 square kilometres. To understand this crude continent, yes, a deliberate double entendre, we need to look at the guardians of this treasure, the states in Africa and the corporate dash for oil cash. Only then might we know whether Africa is cursed or blessed by oil. At the heart of Africa's oil complex is the Gulf of Guinea. Nigeria's large reserves, big oil fields with rising output and promise, but it has been troubled too.
The Niger Delta is a classic case of what has been effectively over time, we're looking at 50 years of development here and history of mismanagement in the oil industry by the central state, initially in Lagos, now in Abuja. And while they've made recent attempts at reform and to improve it, they haven't yet come up with the right formulas.
Huge deep-water oil discoveries have been developed, Shell's Bonga Field and Total's Akpo. All super majors but BP hold core assets here. Congo-Brazzaville, once strife-torn, attracts big and small oil players. The DRC's offshore oil is tiny, run by independents like Perenco, its future tied to vast inaccessible inland basins. It has opened a bid round to entice more companies.
If we use the bid round, we will be clear, the situation will be clear for everybody. We are trying to cancel corruption and so on in this matter.
In Cameroon and Gabon, the oil industry appears steadily stressed, urgently needing acreage leasing and oil discovery.
Over the last few years, Cameroon and Gabon have lost traction. They've been also two countries, as an example, that have not been very aggressive in the international competitive market of auctions and bid rounds and so on. They've changed their tune in the last year or two.
Unrewarded yet are Benin and Togo, both opened up offshore. The Chevron-led West African gas pipeline takes gas from Escravos in Nigeria to Benin and Togo, as far as Ghana. Another project seeks to link Nigeria's gas to Europe overland through Niger onto Algeria. Nigeria is critical to this drama, but bedeviled by its past, earning the epithet the land of no tomorrow. With 36 billion barrels proven and 190 trillion cubic feet of gas, it has long been cursed by domestic troubles and conflict in the Delta states. Refineries barely function. It imports products and exports crude under OPEC quota. If new oil reforms do not work, Nigeria could be in deeper trouble. Poverty is acute, despite $500 billion earned from oil so far. Arson, kidnappings, insurrection, sabotage with heavy-handed state responses mark the past. Shell is shifting asset focus outside the Delta away from the onshore. Many foreign companies will not enter Nigeria. This opens opportunity for local independence. It has also allowed entry to state oil companies from China, India and Korea. Nigeria, an oil giant, is a lumbering one. Equatorial Guinea, population at 500,000, a former Spanish colony, endured a tumultuous past. The presidential family commands the levers of state and oil. Uncertain dynastic succession hangs over the future. A failed mercenary coup in 2004 did not deter corporate investors. More foreign companies have entered the offshore game around Bioko and the Rio Muni basin off the mainland. Marathon built an LNG plant on Bioko Island. Another is planned. State company G-Petrol has taken larger equity stakes in oil and LNG and paid with cash. Income per head is rising, even while poverty is still widespread.
I think the ones that have been there over time have found a modus vivendi with the government. The government itself has commercialized its state operations in G-Petrol and Sonagas. They've bought their way into some assets.
Angola is a rising oil colossus. Block 17, the Golden Block, is held by super majors. Angola's offshore reaped a whirlwind of discoveries in the 1990s. Angola has reached capacity of 2 million barrels a day, joined OPEC and started its first LNG venture. In 2009, while Nigeria lost nearly 900,000 barrels a day capacity through its Delta Wars, Angola overtook it. There's more to come in Angola.
Angola is hydrocarbon rich. It's rebalancing that with the development of export and domestic gas projects. That's a more stabilizing component for government revenue. And at the same time, it's seeking to diversify out of oil by taking the receipts, if you like, the fiscal benefits from its oil and plowing it back into other activities.
State company Sonangol is a state within a state, growing fast and aided by China. Its international portfolio is expanding. The hottest oil play in Africa, Angola is a tough and competitive environment requiring deep pockets and long arms. Libya, independent 40 years with only Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in power, weathered sanctions which hobbled its oil industry. Since desanctioning, it's seen bid rounds, company entries, ambitious oil plans with LNG and gas hopes for export to Europe. America's majors, plus independents and the Oasis Group, Marathon Hess and ConocoPhillips are back. An OPEC member seeking 3 million barrels a day, claiming 100 billion barrels of undiscovered oil with 30 billion barrels proven and 55 trillion cubic feet of proven gas, it reopened in 2005. Roadshows were flooded with suitors, all wanting to hold the oil maiden's hand.
The heavily petroliferous producer-exporter countries like Libya have very tough terms and opened up after sanctions accordingly. Likewise, you've seen tougher constraints applied now in Nigeria, which is undertaking reforms, and in Angola.
Algeria too is bound to Europe, with gas markets and pipelines across the Mediterranean and LNG exports to North Atlantic consumers. It's like Gulliver, a gas giant in chains founded on a tough regime of contracts and awards. Algeria seeks 2 million barrels a day later this decade. Sonatrach is a powerhouse.
Sonatrach in Algeria is a huge player and company. It dominates the game in Algeria. It's got numerous subsidiaries and joint ventures in and out of the country. It's a major gas supplier, both LNG and pipeline gas into Europe and other markets.
On Africa's northeast quadrant, Egypt plays a key role in LNG ventures, pipeline gas to Arab states, and in exploration. The state oil complex is huge, slow to act, and sphinx-like in nature. Yet many private oil companies have flourished, like its independent oil player, National Petroleum Company.
Egypt has built up very, very successfully its gas side with discoveries onshore and most importantly in the West Mediterranean Delta areas with LNG ventures with BG and ENI and other players. And it's grown its gas reserves and it's exporting gas also by pipeline.
Below the Sahara, the Sahel's Sea of Sand stretches from Mauritania and Senegal through Mali, Niger and Chad to Sudan. This vast Central African rift system is full of oil and gas potential. Many companies, large and small, have taken up acreage. It will soon be time for the ultimate test, the drill bit.
I think, there is a certain amount of money available to chase very risky propositions, but have very high upside. I mean, some of the risking that the engineering companies do on resources is 20 to 1.
In Niger, China's CNPC acquired the once ExxonMobil-held Agadem block, then thought uncommercial, where 313 million barrels of proven oil is to be developed. Chad's oil was found years ago, but politics and conflicts stalled development. ExxonMobil now produces around 150,000 barrels per day, shifted by export pipeline to Cameroon. In Africa, wars have been fought over land, water, ethnicity, religion, borders, and now another casus belli, oil, as in Sudan. South Sudan seeks an independent state, the border between north-south defined around division in the oil fields. It's like separating Siamese twins with complex and intertwined history, held together or separated with rich oil promise. A desanctioned Sudan will attract many an oil company, as would South Sudan. Here, China has dominated so far, but seeks more of Africa's oil promise.
China has built up a portfolio. It was a latecomer to the state company entry into Africa. Came in through China National Petroleum Corporation initially into Sudan, built up its asset-based portfolio, production, reserves there, and spread elsewhere. Been followed by China National Offshore Oil Corporation that came in initially into Morocco, then into the Gulf of Guinea plays, and is also now in Kenya, and Sinopec as well, which is very deeply entrenched in Angola.
Elsewhere, new oil domains are rising. Once a slave coast, then Gold Coast, today an oil coast. Ghana basks in the oil sunshine. Governments and Ghana National Petroleum Corporation wants a piece of the oil pie. From 2011, Ghana will reap the fruits of oil discoveries to reach in time 250,000 barrels a day. To avoid the Nigerian syndrome, government has sought reforms to manage this wealth.